What were you doing prior to involvement with cults?
I was in graduate school working on my dissertation on depression, a theoretical dissertation. And I was at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I came back to Boston because I missed the rough and tumble, the mellowness of California. It had gotten boring. And I looked up Jack Clark, with whom I had worked at the Lindemann Mental Health Center before I started graduate school. And he was beginning to look into cults, and it interested me. It was kind of the convergence of my interests in psychology, religion, and philosophy. So it was really more of an intellectual interest at first, changed over time, but that's what I was doing and what got me interested in it. It was pure coincidence. I stumbled into a career, as do many people.
Will you trace the line between that interest and tell us about the development, trace the development of the AFF-ICSA program from the beginning?
Well, initially, we got together with you, Bob Schecter, Roger Daly. We used to meet informally, and we were going to start a counseling organization. But then we decided to hook up with Kay Barney, who had formed the American Family Foundation, because it was already set up as a 501c3, and Kay was happy to connect with us. Initially, we formed the Center on Destructive Cultism, which was a program of AFF, but after a few years, it was the tail wagging the dog, and we just dropped Center on Destructive Cultism and just used American Family Foundation. So our initial thought, we thought we were going to form a think tank. I thought I was going to have an academic position without all the headaches that academics have to go through. And instead I just got different headaches. And we wound up changing over time because of the, in a sense, the moral pressure of people who were hurting. And they would come to us looking for help, for guidance, for information. And that came to dominate what we were doing more and more as the years went by. We never lost sight of the academic grounding of it, which I think is what distinguished AFF from other organizations in the field. We did writing when we could and research when we could, but pretty early on we had to respond to the needs of people who were hurting. And we also did public education. In the early years in the 80s, we used to speak a lot to churches and schools and civic groups. Most of the people seeking help were families whose kid had joined the cult, and they were interested in essentially getting them out. At the time, deprogramming was still common. We always kept our distance from deprogrammers. And at that time, deprogramming implied snatching, kidnapping. So from a professional standpoint, as professionals, you really, you had to keep your distance from the deprogrammers. And our work with families was more on helping them do kind of an individualized assessment of their situation. So I had questionnaires that I developed for families where we looked at the family history, the history of the person who was involved, as well as the group. And that mental health approach, which came natural to us, I don't think was not natural for most of the deprogrammers, for whom the focus was on the group and why the group is bad and why the leader is corrupt, etc. So we brought, I think, that mental health dimension into the field.
The brainwashing metaphor, how do you deal with that?
I think we use the term just as we use the term cult because that was the term that people were using, that newspapers were using, and if you have to communicate with people, you have to use terms that they use. But I think very few of the mental health professionals who were involved, both our small group and the advisory board that we came to form, which consisted of not only mental health professionals, but a lot of mental health professionals, clergy, educators, and few academicians. Most of us, I think, felt uncomfortable with both terms. You know, they were too sensationalistic. But we could never come up with a term that resonated, that was accurate. Margaret Singer, for a while, put forth SIMSI, systematic manipulation of psychological influence, I think it was. Something like that. It was an acronym. And it was more accurate than brainwashing was. But when you're communicating with, you know, ordinary people, it just didn't fly. And since ordinary people looking for help was our primary constituency, we had to talk in a language they spoke. So we would use those terms, but we would try to define them with more nuance than was traditionally the case.
Right. You have now great connections with people all over the Western world and the Eastern world, as a matter of fact. How did this develop?
Through conferences, mainly. Initially, there were a few people from Europe who were independently forming organizations, mostly, again, of parents concerned about young adult children getting involved in groups. And people heard about each other somehow. Oftentimes it might be you read a newspaper article and it mentions a name, and there were so few people concerned about the issue at the time that they would connect with each other. So Daphne Vane from England came to some of our early advisory board meetings, and Claire Chambrion from France came to some of them. So and also Fritz Haag from Germany, but the latter two are both dead now, came to our advisory board meetings. So from early on, there was an international dimension, but then we took some steps to maybe expand that. In 88 or 89, we organized a meeting in Europe of the European organizations that had formed AFF, the Cult Awareness Network. Mike Kropfeld came from InfoCult. And we were talking about ways of coordinating with each other. So the relationships were formed, but the international dimension didn't take off until we began to have annual conferences. We had conferences in the 80s and early 90s, but they weren't regular. It was an occasional thing. Starting in 98, maybe 99, I don't remember precisely, we had the first of what would become an annual conference. And Europeans and even people from Australia and Japan heard about it, and they came to our conferences. So that by, I think, 2000, we had a conference in Seattle, maybe about 200, 220 people, and probably 50 of them were from outside the United States and Canada. We had a large number. Then in 2005, we had our first conference in Europe, in Madrid, at the Autonomous University of Madrid. And since then, we've alternated the conference between Europe and the United States. Mm-hmm. So in odd years, it's in Europe, and in even years, it's in the US. That has expanded the international reach, although there's some bifurcation because of the expense of traveling. So, you know, we'll have fewer Europeans, although we still will get 30, 40 people from outside US and Canada. And we'll have, in Europe, we have a lot more Europeans coming and fewer North Americans. So currently, approximately a third of the people who are members of ICSA are outside the US and Canada, quarter to a third roughly.
Putting together an advisory board, looking back, how useful were they in prosecuting the program and the public image?
It was really vital. It was perhaps the best advice our fundraising consultant at the time gave us, forming an advisory board. He was thinking of doing it to make connections to funding sources. Turns out that the people on the advisory board didn't have many connections to funding sources, but they were very useful because it was a group of smart people and dedicated. I mean, people didn't go into this field just to make money, because there was no money in it. Those who were in private practice, for the most part, were successful in their private practice, and particularly when they started seeing former cult members in counseling, a lot of them had financial needs, so they would drop their fees, and they could have filled the slots with paying clients that weren't involved in cults. Mm-hmm. So it was a group of people that you could admire. There was intelligence, there was a common moral outrage. I've often said that that's the thing that drew together people from widely varying political backgrounds. We had everyone from the, not the far right or the far left, but from the right to the left politically. We had every religious persuasion, non-religious. We had atheists, we had evangelical Christians, Catholics. Particularly in the early years, there were a number of priests, rabbis, ministers who were involved. And despite all of these differences, there was a common moral outrage about how people were being treated in cults. Jack once used the phrase to describe cults as the impermissible experiment. Jack Clark, that is. And what he meant is that cults were using psychological techniques of control to change people, to induce conversions. And it was showing what much of the social psychological literature had shown, that behavior can be influenced to a great extent by the conditions around it. And at that time, the traditional psychoanalytic view was still kind of dominant, that behavior is a function of the unconscious processes that originate in the first 5 years of life. So Jack saw that saw cult conversions as real life experiments on behavior control, like Zimbardo's prison experiment, Ash's conformity experiments. But these experiments were happening on real people, and they were changed in really profound ways sometimes.
Going back a bit, was Wingspread Conference very important or not?
Yeah, the Wingspread Conference was in 84 or 85. Wingspread is a prestigious conference center in Racine, Wisconsin, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Rabbi Jim Rudin was instrumental in getting us to do that. We worked with Jolly West, who was head of the Neuropsychiatric Institute at UCLA. We partnered in that. And we brought about 40 experts together from around the world, had discussions on various topics. Jolly and I wrote a report on the conference afterwards, which is in our archives online. And again, it solidified that international dimension, and it also underlined the academic underpinnings of the work that we did. I think that's what distinguished us from a lot of other people who were active in the field. I mean, we weren't just pointy-headed academicians studying abstruse and abstract concepts. It was more applied research. I mean, we were studying things, but with a goal of making it be useful to people.
In the early period, what would you say were the greatest problems that the organization had?
Money, and money. In the early 80s, and throughout the 80s, we would often half jokingly say, well, we won't be bankrupt for 3 months. Oh, wow, we're really doing well. We won't be bankrupt for 6 months. It really was difficult to fundraise, still is. This is an extremely difficult field to raise money in. We were fortunate in getting some large grants from some foundation grants and wealthy donors that really sustained us long enough to gradually build up the smaller donations. But throughout the 80s, we would have collapsed financially if it were not for the large donations that we got. And that's what made it precarious, because it wasn't like multi-year promises of grants. It was year to year. So every year we had to sweat, is such and such going to renew the grant or not? So that was a constant struggle. And I think we were learning how different this field is. We had a fundraising consultant in the early days, and they were very impressed with us. And direct mail marketing was coming into its own at that time. Richard Viguerie was making tons of money for Republican causes through direct mail. And our fundraising consultant was just so impressed, with the work we did, that direct mail, that's how you do it. And we wound up wasting $20,000 plus on a direct mail campaign that produced about $2,000 and maybe 300 donors out of 100,000 people who received personalized letters, from daisy wheel printers, dear so-and-so. And that lesson, along with other lessons, told us that this field does not motivate people to reach in their pockets to donate as they might with other fields, like children who were hurting and so on. There was, I think, an ambivalence. We used to feel it was infotainment. People were fascinated to hear about cults and so on, but it wasn't something that they saw as a cause to support, with certainly exceptions, otherwise we wouldn't have survived. And that was the other thing, that those who supported us understood the issues. They understood the moral outrage, the concept of the impermissible experiment. They weren't donating because they got anything out of it personally. Many of them wanted to remain anonymous because they didn't want people to know that they had a family member involved in a cult. So it was really tough and remains tough. The difference today is, because of the membership structure, we have a larger and more stable base of smaller donors. And our goal in the years ahead is to increase that membership so that the organization can become self-supporting.
The cults harassed the organization and some of the individuals. Can you speak a little about that, and also tell us if that's diminished over the years?
Yeah, it certainly has diminished. When we first started out, we had our first advisory board meeting at Dunphy's on the Cape. And somehow the Moonies and others got wind of our meeting. We later learned that at least some groups used to go through our garbage, and that's how they would find out what we were doing. And they showed up at the meeting with cameras, media. And the anecdote that sticks in my mind from that meeting was when one fellow went up to Jack, practically in his eyes with the big camera. In those days, the cameras were big with flashes and so on. Well, another one was standing on the side with another camera. And it was quite obvious to me he was trying to sucker punch Jack to get Jack to lose his temper and swing at the cameraman, and then the other guy would take the camera and they would use it to harass or sue. Fortunately, Jack didn't go for the bait, and nothing happened other than people got upset and annoyed, and one of the attendees, prominent person, ran out, and he left because he didn't like the harassment. We were harassed at Wingspread. We were accused of plotting the final solution, and the propaganda pieces had all kinds of Nazi imagery. So, for example, one that I remember, in the midst of all this Nazi talk, they talked about a German who has written anti-religious tracts. That German was Pastor Friedrich Hack, who was the head of the Bavarian Lutheran Church's Apologetics Institute. He was a theologian, but this propaganda had an impact. And at that point, this was at the Wingspread Conference, we had to bring in an observer to observe, to see, it was constant. It went through the 80s into the 90s. When CAN, the Cult Awareness Network, was driven into bankruptcy after fending off 38 suits or so on, then there was more focus on us. But I think what happened is, because of certain spies that were working for a particular cultic organization, they found out that we actually weren't deprogramming people. We weren't consorting with deprogrammers, whereas elements of the old CAN were. And that made us less of a threat. Also, we began to reach out to the academicians, the so-called cult apologists, and even to cult members. In '98, I think it was, I met with Anutama Dasa, who was and still is the public affairs director of ISKCON, the Hare Krishna organization. I met with him with Dave Clark and Joe Kelly, two exit counselors who had done Krishna deprogrammings. He had approached us. I give him credit for that. And we felt that he was on the level, that he was sincerely trying to initiate dialogue. And we had a program in which Anutama, another Hare Krishna, a brilliant woman who was a Harvard-trained lawyer, Joe Kelly and Steve Eichel, who had done work with Krishna, and I think I moderated the panel, had a panel discussion. And this was something that was a little scary for us at the time. We didn't know how much opposition there would be. And to my pleasant surprise, at the end of it, there was a rush. It reminded me of Filene's basement sales in Boston, of people coming up to get copies of the paper of Radha, God, I forget her name, the woman. She had talked about human rights and women in ISKCON, and she was voicing her disagreement with the organization to which she remained loyal. It showed that, there was more variation within this organization, which was viewed by many as one of the preeminent cults, than many people in our orbit had thought. And it turned out to be a positive thing. There were some people who were upset. And then Eileen Barker approached us, and we began to have dialogue and invite to our conferences the so-called cult apologists, and what we discovered when we talked is we had a lot more in common than people realized. There were different perspectives, different emphases, and different points of view on things. But in one of my writings, I put forth the proposition that some cults harm some people sometimes. We can disagree about how many, what are the mechanisms, is it brainwashing, is it not brainwashing, how badly people are harmed, what percentage are harmed. You can disagree on quantitative variables, but don't tell me nobody is harmed. And we could get agreement on at least that basic bottom line principle. And that enabled us to have dialogue. And I think because cultic groups were in touch with the so-called pro-cultists, I think they came to see us differently, and we weren't as much of a threat as the Cult Awareness Network had been. So the harassment didn't end completely, but it diminished over time. And we didn't try to keep them out of our conferences. I mean, I remember for a lot of conferences, there'd usually be 4 or 5 people from one of the prominent groups, and they usually would register in cash. And one conference, they hadn't registered, and they're outside, and I said to the fellow, "Aren't you going to register?" I said, "We depend upon you. You're on profit margin. Come on, come register." And that's the opposite of the Cult Awareness Network, which tried to keep cult members out. When they picketed us at the conference at the University of Minnesota, Pat Ryan went out and said, could you get some more picketers to come, because it's really helping us to motivate students to come to our conference. So I think that kind of attitude of, we don't have anything to hide, come on in. I think that ultimately reduced the harassment. So it still comes up because there's so many different groups and there are small groups, but generally we don't have that sense of imminent attack that we had in the 80s and early 90s.
Am I right to assume that the gross harassment of Jack was rare, and that board members, individuals, were not harassed very much? Or were they?
Well,
like you and I were not harassed.
Yeah, but we weren't harassed in part because Jack was protecting us.
Okay.
He was the lightning rod, and he took the flak. Others were harassed. Jack got it maybe worse than anyone else, other than perhaps Margaret Singer. But at the time of the Wellspring conference, I know several people had visits, their bosses had visits, like Sandy Andron in Miami, who's working in the Miami Jewish school system. His boss was visited or got letters. The Wingspread Foundation. But that personalized targeting, I think, was aimed mainly at the people who were most public, which was Margaret and Jack. The deprogrammers, of course, were major targets. But anybody could be. There was always a risk, and there still is today for former members. A lot of former members today will start websites. They want to tell the world about what a creep their guru or their leader or pastor is and how bad the group is. And depending upon how litigious the group may be, the ex-member could wind up being sued. I did a small survey a few years ago on free speech, and I don't remember the figures offhand, but there were at least several dozen people who had written and who had been sued by cultic groups, usually for saying things that were critical of the group. Now, sometimes the ex-members may not so much invite, but may facilitate a lawsuit by writing or speaking irresponsibly. And one of the things we've tried to do on occasion is to direct people to sources of information to help them sort of speak with the law in mind. So the example I like to use is, you know that the leader has sexually abused children. You've talked to the children in the group, and you publicly proclaim so-and-so is a child molester. That child molestation is a crime. You're accusing him of a crime. He has not been convicted of a crime. So if he sues you, you have to prove that it's true. And they say that the truth is the absolute defense against defamation. What they don't say is if you can afford to pay for the lawyer who's going to show that you tell the truth. But in a cultic situation, it becomes even more complex because people won't testify. So you may be telling the truth, but if you get sued in court and you have to demonstrate that it's truth, you may not be able to do so because the people who could prove it won't testify. So there's still a chilling effect that goes on in this field. Nothing like it was in the early 80s on the whole, but it's still there.
I'd like to talk now a bit about the responses to AFF and ICSA in a number of different constituencies. For example, among religious organizations generally, and in particular, how they have responded to your work.
It's varied over time. In the early days, the early 80s, there were Jewish organizations that were concerned specifically about cults. There were Jewish federations in Miami, Baltimore, New York, Los Angeles, maybe Dallas. There were several. There were at least half a dozen in the country. And that was because the cults that were prominent at the time were recruiting a lot of Jewish kids from campuses. And it was thought, were Jews particularly susceptible? I don't think that they were. I think it was just a question that Jews happen to be more prominent in the campuses. New York City has a lot of Jews, and if they're recruiting on New York campuses, they're going to pick up a lot of Jews. So we had a lot of interaction with them. There were Catholic priests and there were certain Protestant ministers who were interested, but not much with the denominations themselves. The Jewish organizations, from a denominational standpoint, were most organized. There was a parallel evangelical cult watch movement. There's an organization that still exists today, Evangelical Ministries to New Religious Movements, EMNR. But the evangelical cult watch organizations were more focused on the belief system, on heresy. These were one of the prominent organizations in Berkeley was called Spiritual Counterfeits Project. They did good work. We had relationships with some of their people. They were driven into bankruptcy because of a book that they wrote, and then they came back and they were never what they used. They were a shadow of their former self. But organizationally, it hasn't been there. We've always had religious people involved, and we've related well, I think, to many of the evangelical cult watch organizations. Quite a number of people within our network were also active in the evangelical organizations. The Catholic Church, we've had individuals. So I'd say our relationship is more with individuals within denominations, but the denominations themselves have pretty much, I think, kept away from this field.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the phenomenon, if I can use the word, is less, has diminished over the years, or is it simply that the public is and the media are not so aware of what's happening?
I'd say that we don't have the number of page one stories. If you would look at the number of stories that get printed that come to our attention, there are many more news stories than we can summarize in ICSA Today in the news section. And that was true in the early years. The Cult Observer that you used to edit covered a lot of the news at the time, and people would say, gee, a cult's still around. We used to hear that in the 80s. We still hear it today. And, we kind of laugh. Well, yeah, because we get the stories, but it's not page one. It's not Jonestown. It isn't Om Shinrikyo. And we have not, fortunately, had a cult disaster for 20 years now. I think we had Waco and the murders of the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments. That was in Africa, so that didn't get as much media attention. So people don't think it's around, but I don't think there's any evidence that it's diminished. I mean, we can't say scientifically whether it's increased or diminished, but certainly the research we did in the early 90s indicated that about 1 to 2% of the population has had at least a transient involvement with the cultic group.
We've already alluded to academics, but can you generalize and say the response of academics to this situation is different from what it was initially in the early years?
Yeah, there's less academic interest, I think. But in most of the academic interest that we're aware of is going on in Europe, not much in the United States. Mm-hmm. In the early days, the sociologists became interested in the field, partly because it was a new phenomenon, the Jesus groups that came out, the guru groups in the 60s and 70s. But they were energized because they had a different kind of moral outrage from what we had. Their moral outrage was directed toward deprogramming. And when we started talking to each other, I think it became clear that those of us who were helping, let's say the mental health professionals, were seeing the casualties. And I used to often try to warn my fellow mental health professionals, scientifically, we're seeing a self-selected sample. We're seeing the people who were hurt. The sociologists who actually went in and saw groups, they saw a wider variety. And, not everybody is hurt equally, even in a group that's highly controlling and highly destructive. You will have individual variations depending upon the psychology. So the sociologists were energized because of the kidnapping primarily. And I think that was a moral issue for many of them. And because that divide between the pro-cultists and the anti-cultists started off in the early 80s, there wasn't communication. In the very early days, there were, in year two, we had interesting conversations with Tom Robbins, one of the more prolific writers in the sociology community, and good conversations. But that got cut off when things hit the courts. In the early 80s, when some lawyers were having success in suing cults, and cults were hiring expert witnesses, and the people suing cults were hiring expert witnesses, that cemented the divide, because then you had to worry that what you say to someone in the other camp could get back, and a lawyer is going to use it to advance his case. It's not, the court system doesn't operate on finding truth. The presumption is you put the two gladiators in the ring and, truth will win out. But that presumption doesn't always hold. So, the whatever dialogue we had died in the mid-'80s. But we were able to bring it back again in the late '90s. But also, the lawyers by that time had discovered that there isn't much money to be made in suing cults. Pete Georgiadis, who was one of the most successful trial attorneys in the late '80s and early '90s, gave a talk at our 2003 conference in Atlanta in which he talked about why lawyers don't take cult cases, including him. And the reason is, you can't make money. It's difficult to make money, and you have partners you're answerable to. So even when he won, you could win the judgment, but getting the money was a whole other process. Yeah. So once lawyers get out of it, it was easier for academicians and mental health professionals to talk civilly to each other.
There's a whole area of providing information to the public and to professionals that comes out of AFF and the International Public Studies Association. I remember one of those giant cardboard pigeonhole things that you got initially. It had about 100 pigeonholes, and you would put documents in them, news clippings and the like. Can you talk a little bit about the development of your informational system and how it's going now?
Well, technology.
Publications as well.
Yeah. What you're referring to is basically with slots, like letter trays. Only there'd be there were 96 of them, and we'd have different groups, and we'd file material, and we had Xeroxes, and we had a wonderful volunteer that we both loved, Carol Turnbull, who used to put packets together for people, and someone would write in for information, and they'd get a packet of Xeroxes, mostly newspaper articles. There's a handful of professional articles being written at the time. And for many years, that's how we functioned. Paper was essential. Up until maybe the turn of the century, when we were able to begin to respond electronically. So that now, for example, if someone wants information, I can direct them to pages on the website. So like we have a collection for former members that has a couple of dozen articles. All of these originated as paper, but they're now available electronically. And these days, most people email. So someone emails me and I can reply, I can attach things, I can give them links and so on. So in a matter of minutes, I can direct people to information that in the old days would have taken half an hour to copy it, to prepare the envelope, to write the address, put the stamps on and send it off to someone. So the technology has really greatly increased our capacity to deliver information and to direct people to information. On the other hand, there's so much information that the challenge we have now is trying to condense it into manageable bites for people. Like one of the things we need are succinct essays on specific topics, practical kinds of topics. And writing a succinct essay is one of the hardest things to do when you know a lot about a field, because you know what you're leaving out, and you have a sense of accuracy. It's easier to write succinctly about something you don't know about than to write succinctly about something you do know about. And that's one of the challenges that we have in the years to come.
Well, is there anything you'd like to add to what you've said? It's been very comprehensive and very good thus far.
Well, I I'd say one of the things that's significant that we didn't touch on is how much more diversity there is today in the numbers of groups and kinds of groups that people are concerned about. I often will refer to a survey that journalists Conway and Siegelman did in 1978. I'm going by memory, but approximately they had about 440 subjects taken from the Cult Awareness Network. It was a selective sample, but it was basically representative of the people who were coming for help to AFF and to the Cult Awareness Network. Those 440 some odd people came from roughly 45 different groups. Almost 50% of them came from the Unification Church, and about 75% of them came from the top 5 groups, which was the UC, Hare Krishna, I think Scientology, the Way International, I think Divine Light Mission might have been the 5th. So in those days, if we knew a lot about the Unification Church, you actually had a lot of information for almost half the ex-members who might have come in. In 91, I did a survey of 300, a similar survey from our network, a snowball sample of 308 subjects. They came from 101 different groups. The Unification Church was a minor player, maybe 4 or 5% of my sample was from the Unification Church. The top 5 in my sample only accounted for about 30% rather than 75%. So there was more variety. Today, it's even more so. I did a small survey of about 271 people, and of those who answered the question, gave a name to the group, I went through and I listed each group. There were approximately 2.2 people per group, which means the vast majority of groups had one person in it. And many of the groups are totally new to us. So when we have someone write and they're asking about a particular group, the odds are very good that in spite of having almost 40 years in this field, I never heard of the group. And much of it is on the Christian fringe, you know, pastors that go awry or non-denominational churches that get cultic. But it's not completely. I mean, there's an endless number of gurus. So this means that AFFs and ICSAs, which we changed the name from AFF to ICSA in 2004, it means that our focus on process, understanding the processes by which people get seduced into groups, they get changed, they get exploited, and the difficulties they have when they leave. Process is much more important than information on a particular group, because the odds are pretty high that you're not going to have much information on a particular group. But what we've learned is that the processes that cause people to get hurt are pretty similar from group to group.
How would you characterize the assistance given to our organization by board members?
Well, I mean, it's heroic in the amount of time that people put into this. And our board consists primarily of people who have been in the trenches. So, for example, the workshops that we did in Colorado for 25 years, Roseanne Henry, Carol Giambalvo, Nancy Michelone, Leona Fernari, they volunteered an entire weekend, and all of the planning and the post-planning, and not counting the conferences they attend, the number of people they talk to, for 25 years. This was all volunteer work. You know, some of them He may have private practices, but again, it's not a monetary interest, because
Right.
they could have probably a more lucrative clientele by specializing in areas other than cults. So there's a dedication, I think, in the board that's admirable, and I think we help keep each other going, because it's kind of the respect that we feel for each other. You know, when you get discouraged or you run into problems and so on, it's sort of like we owe each other. So it's a good board. It's a congenial board.
Okay, well, I'll turn it off, and I just,
Can I ask a one question? Because you touched on it, Bob, which is like over the years, you know, you seem to, let's say, the change in terms of the number of people involved in the organization in different facets, not just the board members, but just, you know, the number of people involved and like what kind of activities being undertaken by the organization.
Well, yeah, you know, in the early days, we had our advisory board, which consisted of a few dozen people that would come to the advisory board meeting. And they were individually involved. Many of them were involved with different organizations, you know, the Jewish organizations. Some were mental health professionals. And there wasn't a whole lot of writing going on. But when we started the journal, Cultic Studies Journal in '85, that provided an opportunity for people to write. So over the years, probably a couple of hundred different people contributed in that regard. And today, our annual conferences will draw 200 to 250 people, and almost half of them are speakers. So for instance, at the coming conference in Philadelphia, we've got about 125 people who are speaking or giving poster presentations from all over the world. So that kind of activity was, we couldn't dream of that in the early 80s and 90s, the number of people. I mean, because we were smaller, we were sort of tight with each other in the 80s and 90s, and friendships formed. Now it's many more people are involved. So it's, you know, it's more dispersed, and the organizational challenge is to try to sustain relationships and strengthen relationships when there are so many. And, you know, I'm not sure exactly how we're going to do that, but that's one of the things we're wrestling with.
Mm-hmm.
Did that answer your question?
I had a comment, because I want to talk about like people, just talk about people who are like like ICSA today. It's basically volunteer run, you know, compared to like stuff that organized stuff that's going on that is basically
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, that we actually have people volunteering, although, you know, Carol Turnbull was the equivalent back then, you know, so only the volunteering in the early days was Xeroxing and putting packets together. But now we have, you know, Ann Stamler's done a magnificent job as a volunteer with the ICSA Today magazine. You know, we have our editorial board for the journal, and people have different roles as section editors. So we do have a larger number of people who are volunteering on a regular basis than we did in the early days. We were more staff. Most of the work was done by staff in the 80s and 90s, and trying to get people to write or to speak at conferences. But I think we're more organized today, more systematic, like the conferences. The annual conference is almost down to a science. We send out a call for papers in May or June of the year preceding the conference. In the past 5 or 10 years, we've been averaging at least 100 speakers per conference. Many of them have spoken at prior conferences, but I'd say, based on the stats we've collected, between 30 and 40% of the people attending an annual conference are attending for the first time. So this is a level of involvement that we couldn't dream of in the early days. And that's one of the good things today.
Bob, we'll talk with you, of course, separately, but anything more now?
Just trying to think from a PR perspective.
Let me.
Because if it comes out, it's like, okay, the problem is there's so much, because I think Journal and Phoenix Project, in the sense of all these people that are, like, when you look back in the past, your advisors were like, they come together, it's basically schmooze for a weekend, and goodbye, thank you, versus now, there's stuff going on by all of these people. I mean, it's too hard to enumerate, but it's like, is there a way just to kind of like, in a soundbite, do something like that? Because that, to me, is like, from a PR point of view, I think people will get a, kind of a very positive reaction. So I don't know how to do that.
I'm not sure what you mean. I think you're selling some of the advisory board shot in the early days, because we were doing things. We organized the Wingspread Conference. We started the Cultic Studies Journal. We had some really good articles in the early issues of the journal. We had that special volume 2, number 2, Cult Evangelicals and the Ethics of Social Influence, where we put together a team of evangelicals met with us, and we had many contributions. Today, though, I'd say we have more that arises spontaneously because of the larger number of volunteers. So, and it's like the New York Educational Committee that started a few years ago, met independently. I went to maybe the first meeting, but they were on their own, and they developed a whole series of resources on particular topics, sort of brief papers, and they're continuing to do that. And some of it is on topics that weren't covered before, like the role of culture. And that's something that we did not have in the early days, which was, in a sense, independent groups of volunteers coming up with tangible and useful outcome products. And one of the things administratively we're dealing with is just how to keep track and to maintain communications with the growing number of people who are volunteering. And I mean, some cases, people, in a sense, we don't have the coordinating and supervisory manpower to actually keep up with the desire to help. One of our donors once kind of pinpointed, when we were talking about fundraising issues, that our network is motivated by altruism. It really and truly is a genuine altruism, and many of the people who enter the network may be looking for help or information, but even those that are looking for help or information, they want to help others too. So we have to develop mechanisms so that we can do a better job of helping people find an outlet for their altruism, to do something useful and tangible. Well, I mean, that's going to happen. But we have made progress, I think, in changing opinions, at least within the mental health profession. Ed Laudick did a few surveys of professionals, the late Ed Laudick. He was a family physician whose son had committed suicide in a group. And Ed first did a survey of family physicians in Pennsylvania, and he had over 1,000 replies, and 2.2% of them said that either they or a family member had been involved in cults. Then he surveyed psychologists in Pennsylvania, and I think he had about 600 or 700 replying. They had a higher percentage of involvement, I forget, 6 or 7%. But something like a third had seen former cult members in their practice. And there was one question that struck me, because he asked them about whether, it was something to the effect of whether brainwashing should be against the law. And a surprisingly high percentage said yes. And my thought was people in our field would probably be more reluctant to have laws passed on that, because in a sense we're more aware of how such laws could be abused. But that Ed got that result told me that the psychologists in his sample were more aware of cults than we realized. They may not have understood it as well as we would like them to understand it, which is one of the reasons why educating mental health professionals is one of our main goals. But they're certainly aware of it. Now in 1980, 81, parents would go to a mental health professional. They knew absolutely nothing about cults, and the typical response was, well, it's a phase he's going through, he'll get out of it, or else they blame the parents. You know, Jack Clark used to like to tell mental health professionals, mother is not always to blame. You know, because there was the assumption that, well, if your kid is doing something that's self-destructive, he must want it. I mean, we forget. I mean, in those days, there was a lot of mental health professionals thought that battered women had an unconscious masochistic need. You know, they wanted to be beaten unconsciously. There was not the appreciation for the power that environments can have over human psychology. And we've made progress, not just us alone. I mean, the whole psychological field has made progress in that.